Stop me if this sounds familiar. You're maybe prepping for a really crucial meeting. Perhaps you're diving headfirst into a new academic field, or maybe you're just, intensely curious about something and suddenly you feel like you're drowning. Information is just coming at you faster than anyone can possibly process it. I mean, every field, neuroscience, art history, you name it, it's producing data way faster than our ability to structure it.
Yeah, and that universal challenge, that data deluge, is precisely why the methodology used by the people who build our knowledge systems, why it really matters. It's just not enough anymore to categorize a document based on keywords alone.
Yeah.
To truly organize knowledge, you've got to understand the context, the community, and, well, the intellectual structures that produced it in the first place.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're doing today. We are taking a deep dive into that very mechanism, domain analysis, or DA. This is a really critical methodological perspective. Sits right at the heart of information science, IS, and knowledge organization, KO. It's basically the tool that lets experts move beyond just, sorting documents and actually start organizing knowledge itself.
Right, and our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. We're going to synthesize the core theories, we'll track the pretty dramatic historical shifts that led to this perspective, and then we'll look at the practical toolkit, those 11 approaches that professionals are using right now. We really want to show you how DA transforms organizing information from just a technical exercise into something much deeper, a socio-cognitive investigation that's really rooted in social theory. By the end of this deep dive, hopefully you'll have a framework, a way to immediately grasp the core structures holding pretty much any specialized field together.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this, and maybe with a bit of a historical curveball, actually, because it really illustrates how flexible this concept is. When domain analysis was first thought up, it had absolutely nothing to do with libraries or indexing or, the philosophical complexities of social theory. Nothing at all.
That's genuinely one of the most surprising things about DA. The first time the term was actually used, recorded use, was way back in 1980. And it was firmly planted in, well, let's just say the incredibly dry technical soil of computer science, software engineering specifically. It was introduced by a researcher named James Neighbors.
And his goal is purely operational, right? Efficiency, maximizing software reuse.
Precisely, yeah. In the world of large-scale software development, the goal for DA was identifying reusable bits, common operations, objects, relationships that just kept popping up across different systems. And Neighbors really emphasized the target for reusability wasn't just the final code that changes too much. It was the reusability of the analysis and the design stages, much more stable. So it was this rigorous structural exercise, really just meant to streamline software production, cut down on redundancy.
Okay, so we've got this 1980 methodology focused entirely on engineering common patterns for efficiency. How on earth did this highly functional, almost algorithmic tool suddenly jump the fence into information science? And not just jump the fence, but transform into this, well, socio-philosophical revolution.
That pivot is, I think, one of the defining moments in IS history. It happened quite sharply, around 1995. That's when Hjørland and Albrechtsen introduced DA into information science. And they didn't just borrow the name, they fundamentally redefined its entire foundation. They explicitly framed DA not as some computational technique, but as a new high-potential approach, and crucially rooted in a deliberate social paradigm.
Wow, so that must have been revolutionary. It forced the whole field to kind of rethink its identity, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They basically conceived of information science itself as fundamentally a social science. And this idea, this conceptualization, it was a direct challenge, almost an intellectual declaration of war against the dominant research models back then. See, throughout the 70s, the field was really dominated by formal, logical, rationalist approaches. Think about systems focused purely on abstract data modeling, logical structure, treating information like it's just a measurable, universally defined thing.
So DA comes along and essentially says, hang on, those rationalist models, the ones treating information like some neutral input-output process, they're kind of missing the whole point. You can't understand information if you only look at the measurable data or the logical structure of a document.
That's the core philosophical critique, exactly. DA was positioned as a renewal, pushing back hard against those, overly positivistic traditions in IS, the ones focused only on what you could logically measure or quantify. The key idea became this. The best, most coherent, most efficient way to organize information is to study the domains of knowledge in relation to their discursive communities. You absolutely have to understand the community that created the information if you want to organize it properly.
And this whole movement, it got some serious intellectual backing from one of the biggest names in 20th century philosophy, Thomas Kuhn, right?
Oh,
Specifically his work on scientific revolutions.
yes, absolutely. The socio-cognitive approach is deeply, deeply influenced by Kuhn's concept of paradigms. How communities share a worldview and how the structure of knowledge itself fundamentally shifts when a new paradigm takes hold. And this led to a laser focus on knowledge context. Crucially, DA Challenges really rejects the idea of universal mental structures.
Okay, wait, let's pause on that for a second. Rejecting universal mental structures. What does that actually mean for someone trying to build, say, a classification system?
Well, it implies that you simply cannot assume there's a single optimal way to organize knowledge that works for everyone, everywhere, regardless of their context. It directly challenges structuralism and a lot of classical cognitive psychology, which often assumed, that all human brains process information according to some fixed, predefined logical rules. DA argues, no, information processing, retrieval, how we judge relevance, it's entirely dependent on the theory, the culture, the social agreements within a specialized domain. The context isn't just important. The context is the structure you need to understand and organize. If you build a database assuming everyone thinks the same way, you'll only end up efficiently serving the needs of whatever the dominant paradigm happens to be.
Okay, so given that DA is so heavily context dependent, we really need to nail down precisely what a domain means here, because it sounds like a much more dynamic and fluid concept than just, say, a standard academic discipline or a department name on a university website.
That's vital.
Yeah.
Hjørland and his colleagues really stress this. A domain is not static. It's not just a checklist of courses or topics. It is fundamentally a community of thought, or perhaps a discursive community. And it's dynamically defined. It's fundamentally dependent on the underlying theories that shape it.
So that means domains can actually appear or disappear, merge, even divide, based purely on an intellectual breakthrough, not just some administrative decision.
Exactly right. We can see this really clearly historically. Take zoology and botany. For centuries, they were treated as completely separate domains. They had distinct classification systems because they dealt with separate things, animals and plants. Simple enough. But then, once the powerful unifying theory of the cell emerged, those two separate intellectual fields effectively merged. They became the single, more encompassing domain of biology, which is now unified by a shared set of fundamental principles about life at the cellular level. DA highlights that domains are always in flux, always evolving, shaped not just by theories, but by powerful social factors, even political struggles. I mean, just look at how the scientific classification and understanding of homosexuality has evolved over the last century. That change was driven by massive social and theoretical shifts, not just new data.
Right. So if we want to analyze any field, medicine, philosophy, or whatever DA says, we need to view it through a specific three-part analytical lens. I think Hjørland and Hartel formalized this back in 2003, outlining 3 interacting dimensions.
They did. And these are really the 3 pillars you need to grasp to truly understand any domain of knowledge: the ontological, the epistemological, and the sociological. And they're not separate silos. They're deeply interconnected. Right. Analyzing a domain means examining how they constantly interact.
Okay, let's start with the foundation. The ontological dimension. What's that about?
The ontological dimension concerns the concepts about the objects themselves, the being, if you like, or the fundamental reality of the domain. It asks, what is considered to actually exist within this domain? What is the nature of the thing being studied? So for a physicist, the ontology might involve things like quarks, gravity, space-time. For a literary critic, the ontology involves texts, narratives, maybe authorial intention, genre. Getting this right is critical. If you're organizing knowledge in, say, a theology domain, your ontology has to reflect the existence of non-material entities, angels, spirits, whatever. An engineering domain would probably dismiss those entirely.
Makes sense. Then we move from what exists to how we know, the epistemological dimension.
Exactly. That dimension deals with concepts about knowledge itself, and crucially, the accepted ways of acquiring that knowledge within the domain. This includes the methodologies that are considered valid, the accepted theories, the underlying presuppositions, basically, the agreed-upon principles for how objects in the domain are studied and how knowledge claims are validated. Why do some domains rely heavily on randomized controlled trials, while others rely on hermeneutic interpretation of texts? That's the epistemological question. And if you're organizing information for a community that prioritizes qualitative research, a system focused only on organizing quantitative data sets is going to be fundamentally useless to them.
And finally, the sociological dimension. This seems to ground the domain in the real world with actual people and power dynamics.
Correct. The sociological pillar focuses on the groups of people involved, the social structures, the communication flows, the internal division of labor within that domain. It tries to map out who the key authorities are, which institutions really matter, how consensus is achieved, or, maybe more often, fought over. These three aspects, what exists, ontology, how we know it, epistemology, and who is involved in the knowing, sociology, are absolutely inseparable when you're doing a proper domain analysis.
This whole methodology feels like it relies very heavily on a constructivist view of knowledge, doesn't it? Suggesting the domain isn't just some neutral territory waiting for us to draw a map of it.
That is absolutely the cornerstone of the socio-cognitive turn DA represents. DA posits that the domain is not a fixed terrain just waiting passively to be described. It is fundamentally a social construction. It's built up over time through repeated intellectual agreements, disagreements, negotiations, essentially through intersubjective agreements within that community. And therefore, the act of studying it can never be neutral.
Wait, hang on. So the information scientist isn't just an objective observer mapping things out. The researcher is actually participating in shaping the reality they're trying to organize.
Precisely. And that's both the challenge and the power of DA. Think about it practically. When a researcher selects which specific journals to include in a massive bibliometric study, one that's intended to map the structure of a whole domain, those methodological choices, which journals count as core, inevitably influence how the domain is then presented, how it's recognized, maybe even how it gets funded later on. You are literally shaping the map as you draw it, and this leads directly to this core reflexive concept known as the hermeneutic spiral.
The spiral sounds like continuous iteration. Can you maybe elaborate on the practical consequence of the spiral for, say, knowledge professionals? What does it really mean day to day?
Yeah, the hermeneutic spiral describes this continuous reflexive feedback loop. The results of your first study into a domain, say you map out the key concepts, that inevitably modifies your knowledge and understanding as the researcher. Then that new understanding, in turn, affects the methodology you choose for your second study. It might force you to look at different sources or apply different criteria, maybe ask different questions. It forces the researcher to constantly acknowledge their own influence and biases. It prevents that sort of arrogant assumption that your first classification system is somehow final or perfect. It means knowledge organization is an ongoing dynamic process. It's not a one-time classification exercise. You just tick off a list. Okay, so to move from this high-level theory towards more practical application, DA seems to rely on understanding this conceptual trilogy: domain, discourse, community, and language. But you mentioned earlier we have to address the sort of deliberate ambiguity here. Hjørland intentionally avoided giving these terms really rigid hierarchical definitions. Why do that? Why maintain that ambiguity? Well, the flexibility is actually crucial, because rigid definitions, especially hierarchical ones like A is always a subtype of B, often fail completely to capture social complexity. Real life is messy. If you try to create a formal, static definition, you risk missing the dynamic, overlapping ways these concepts actually interact in the real world. So the flexibility prevents the concepts from being sort of boxed in by formal logic. But that said, for practical work, we can provide clear working definitions based on their function within the DA framework.
Right. Let's try and nail down the domain first, as the ultimate unit of focus. How do we define that functionally?
Okay. In the DA framework, the domain is best understood as the specific unit of analysis you choose when you're constructing a knowledge organization system, a KOS. It is that socially and theoretically defined body of knowledge where a group shares those critical ontological and epistemological commitments we just discussed. They share methodologies, they share social semantics. It's basically the specialized intellectual context we're trying to bring some order to.
And I noticed the sources mentioned several synonyms that often get used interchangeably with domain.
Yes, exactly. Because of that flexible definition, depending on who you're reading or the specific research context, you might see the domain referred to as a field, a discipline, maybe a community of practice, situated knowledge, or sometimes just simply the relevant body of literature. The emphasis, though, always remains on that shared social and theoretical context.
Okay, next up, the discourse community. This sounds like the sociological engine that actually brings the domain to life.
That's a good way to put it. The discourse community is the social organization, the group of people, that sets the ordering and limitation of communication within that domain. As Nascimento and Martelletto define them, they are groups that are synchronized in thought, language, and knowledge. They're essentially the gatekeepers, They consolidate meanings, they establish the hierarchies of terms, they set the criteria for what counts as valid terminology, what's significant, what's relevant within that domain.
So, in essence, they're the ones who decide what counts as knowledge and what doesn't within their specific world.
Precisely. They are the fundamental social base for both the theory and the practice of knowledge organization. Just consider the difference between, say, a community of theoretical physicists and a community of Renaissance art critics. Their criteria for relevance, their accepted methodologies, the significance they assign to the same source document, maybe it could be fundamentally different. The discourse community defines those parameters, and any useful KOS has to reflect them accurately.
And that brings us to the third part of the trilogy, language, the medium through which this all operates.
Yes, and language is absolutely fundamental because it's the institution, if you will, responsible for translating the knowledge contained within the domain so it can be disseminated and retrieved. But critically, within DA, language is not treated as some ideal code or a purely logical structure just waiting to be mapped perfectly by a computer algorithm. It's seen as a socio-cultural institution. It's a producer of meanings. It's highly situational, and it's deeply influenced by culture.
Help us unpack that idea of language being situational. How does that actually affect something practical, like indexing?
Okay, think about a simple word like failure. In a medical domain, let's say cardiology, failure is a critical, highly specific ontological term. It relates to clinical outcomes, like heart failure. Its use is incredibly rigorous, very fixed. Now compare that to, say, a literary domain. Failure might be an artistic theme, a psychological state of a character, maybe a critique of a historical movement. Its meaning is much more fluid, more interpretive. Now, if you tried to index medical documents using the relevance criteria of a literary scholar, or vice versa, the entire system would just collapse. It wouldn't work for anyone. So language demands deep contextualization during indexing and retrieval, because its meaning is the result of negotiation and shared social semantics within that specific, specialized community.
I see the connection now. It's not a hierarchy. These three terms, domain, community, language, they're constantly interlocked, interacting with each other.
Exactly. They are fundamentally non-hierarchical. While a discourse community often defines a domain by, say, establishing its boundaries, the use of language simultaneously shapes both the community by defining who belongs, who speaks the right language, and the domain by fixing its core concepts and terms. It's this permeability, this non-rigid relationship that allows domain analysis to actually capture the full, often messy complexity of specialized knowledge in the real world.
Okay, now we get to the really practical part, the toolkit. Hjørland's framework lays out 11 distinct approaches or methods used in information science research to actually study a domain. Before we dive into them, what's the single most important principle we need to keep in mind about using this toolkit?
The absolute imperative for combination. That's the key. These 11 approaches should really never be used in isolation. DA fundamentally demands that researchers combine at least two, preferably more, of these approaches to achieve a truly comprehensive, sort of encompassing characterization of the domain. Using just a single method, say, only doing bibliometrics, just counting co-citations, will only ever give you a very superficial snapshot. It misses the depth. We can maybe group these 11 tools into 4 or 5 conceptual clusters to make them easier to grasp.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start with the first cluster, which seems focused on organization and reference.
Right. This cluster deals with the basic organization of the domain's actual literature. The first approach here is the production of literature guides and subject portals. This means a researcher systematically goes through the sources, organizes them by type, by function, and rigorously evaluates their significance within the field. It's really about developing that authoritative categorization of which sources genuinely matter in that specific domain. What are the foundational texts? What are the key journals?
And the second approach in this cluster moves from the literature itself to the concepts within it. Production and evaluation of special classifications and thesauri.
Yes, this is absolutely critical for organizing the core conceptual content. It involves mapping out the logical structure of categories, concepts, and the specific semantic relations that hold true within that domain. So if you were studying, say, the domain of astronomy, this approach means creating a thesaurus that correctly positions black hole in relation to singularity and event horizon. It has to reflect the actual intellectual hierarchy used by astronomers, not just some generic dictionary definition. This process really reveals the domain's inherent intellectual structure.
Okay, moving on to the second cluster. Core IS processes. This seems to deal directly with retrieval and, importantly, user needs.
That's right. Approach number 3 involves research on indexing and information retrieval competencies in specialties. The goal here is pretty clear: optimizing the visibility and recoverability of documents, but tailored specifically to the unique epistemological demands of that domain. For example, indexing a document for a medical researcher who's looking for causal mechanisms is fundamentally different from indexing that same document for a public policy analyst who's looking for economic impact data. Indexing is always domain-specific in DA.
And approach 4 sounds crucial for making sure this isn't just theoretical knowledge of empirical user studies in specific subject areas.
Yes, this shifts the focus outward, towards the actual users. It means organizing the domain based on documented user preferences, their actual search behaviors, maybe even their mental models of the field. So if a user study reveals that financial analysts, for instance, almost always search using specific industry sector codes, then your KOS must privilege those industry sector codes in its structure. Even if some pure academic theory might suggest organizing by, say, company size is intellectually superior, this approach ensures that the relevance criteria are actually defined by the community being served, not just the system designer.
Okay, the third cluster seems perhaps the broadest: contextualizing studies. This brings in the powerful lenses of history and sociology.
Yes, and approach 5 is probably the best known: the production and interpretation of bibliometric studies. This is where you map sociological patterns, things like co-citation networks, dependencies between researchers, patterns of recognition, mapping relationships between documents, authors, institutions, even geographic areas. It's a powerful sociological mapping tool. But, and this is a critical caveat to avoid falling back into that trap of superficial positivism, just counting numbers without meaning, bibliometrics absolutely must be integrated with epistemological, approach 8, and historical studies, approach 6. Simply counting how many times 2 papers are co-cited isn't enough. You have to understand the underlying theoretical conflict or agreement or debate that made that co-citation significant in the first place.
That makes perfect sense. The numbers are meaningless without the intellectual context behind them.
Precisely. Then, approach 6 involves historical studies of information structures and services. This allows us to understand the construction trajectory of the domain's knowledge systems. What are the traditions? What were the mutual influences over time? Understanding why a particular domain adopted a specific classification system 50 years ago provides essential depth for understanding its current characteristics and maybe even its limitations today.
And approach 7 looks at the container itself, the format, studies of documents and genres.
Right. This reveals the specific organization and structure of document types that are unique or particularly important to a domain. For instance, the highly formalized, hypothesis-driven structure of a typical scientific article is a genre in itself. Now contrast that with the structure of, say, a court ruling, which prioritizes precedent and legal justification, or maybe a corporate annual report, which has its own conventions. These differences in genre are actually ontological statements about what the domain values and how it communicates. DA uses this analysis to inform how classification should handle different document types.
Okay, cluster 4, the theoretical foundation. This sounds like it might be the methodological conscience of the entire toolkit.
You could definitely say that. It's arguably the most fundamental cluster. Approach 8 epistemological and critical studies on different paradigms is considered by Hjørland to be absolutely essential, non-negotiable, really. This involves organizing knowledge based explicitly on the underlying paradigms, the core assumptions, maybe even the vested interests operating within the domain. If you skip this step, Hjørland argues, all your other efforts, bibliometrics, user studies, whatever, become superficial because you miss the fundamental why behind the structures you observe. For example, if you're indexing environmental science literature, you absolutely must understand whether a particular document belongs to, say, a resource management paradigm or a deep ecology paradigm, because their core ontological and epistemological assumptions are completely different, often conflicting.
Yeah, this is where DA really fundamentally breaks with just being a technical information organization task.
Exactly. And closely related is approach 9, the knowledge of terminological studies and discourse analysis in fields of knowledge. This organizes the domain based on semantic and pragmatic criteria, often relying on methods from critical discourse analysis. This kind of analysis, often influenced by historical materialism or sociology, delves into the political and social implications that might be hidden within the specific language choices made by the domain's community. It looks at power dynamics embedded in terminology.
Okay, and finally we have the last cluster covering technological and specialized knowledge.
Right. Approach 10 is studies of structures and institutions of scientific and professional communication. This is really the detailed sociological mapping element identifying the key actors, influential researchers, labs, the important institutions, universities, funding bodies, journals, and mapping the internal division of labor. It helps answer questions like who publishes where? How does the flow of recognition and funding actually define the knowledge landscape in practice?
And approach 11 brings us full circle, almost back to the origins of DA in computer science, but with that crucial socio-cognitive twist, right? Knowledge of methods, results of analytical studies of professional cognition, AI, and knowledge representation in computer science.
Exactly. This approach provides tools for things like knowledge elicitation, often used to produce mental models of experts or to build expert systems in AI. But while DA in computer science often focuses on representing individual expert knowledge for computational tasks, DA in information science uses these tools with a much broader social and collective goal in mind. It integrates these technological insights, but always situates them within the critical understanding gained from the other 10 social, historical, and epistemological approaches. So the big takeaway here is clear. DA is truly the sum of its parts. You absolutely have to combine these approaches to genuinely capture the richness and complexity of any knowledge domain.
Okay, we've spent a good amount of time in the theoretical weeds, which was necessary, but now we get to the payoff. Domain analysis, as you've laid out, has this powerful dual purpose. It's clearly a method for achieving much deeper domain understanding for research purposes, but it's also presented as a kind of non-negotiable professional application for optimizing information systems and services in the real world.
Yes, and this professional utility aspect, it mandates a very specific type of competence from information professionals. Performing DA effectively requires them to possess two distinct but equally important skill sets. First, they need those specific information science competencies we've touched on: classification, indexing, bibliometrics, user analysis, and so on. But second, and this is crucial, they need specialized subject knowledge of the domain itself that they're analyzing.
So it's simply not enough to be a master classifier in the abstract. You also have to genuinely understand the subtle intellectual debates, the key theories, the accepted methods within the actual field you're classifying.
Absolutely, you have to. If an information professional lacks deep subject knowledge, let's say they are tasked with organizing a complex collection on quantum mechanics, but their background is only in general library science, they must consult closely with an expert in that domain to properly interpret the prevailing theories, the methodologies, the implicit practices. Failure to integrate that specialized subject knowledge means you risk building an information system that might be technically sound on the surface, but is ultimately intellectually incoherent or even useless to the actual users in that field.
And this connects directly back to DA's critique of many existing widely used knowledge organization systems, the KOS we mentioned.
Yes, KOS construction is really the primary methodological goal of applied DA. But when we use the DA lens, especially the historical approach 6 and epistemological approach 8 approaches, to analyze traditional KOS things like the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress classification, it becomes very clear that their design, often built decades or even a century ago, fundamentally privileges certain traditional paradigms over others. This happens quite naturally because the original designers were inevitably locked into the dominant theoretical commitments and social assumptions of their own time.
So the system itself isn't neutral at all. It's an intellectual artifact reflecting a specific historical moment and viewpoint.
Exactly. It embodies certain assumptions. Consider, for example, a traditional library classification system applied to art history. Its structure might heavily favor iconographic studies, the analysis of symbols and images within artworks, because that was perhaps the dominant scholarly paradigm when the KOS was first developed. Consequently, that same system might inadvertently disadvantage or even obscure materials that are highly relevant to newer scholarly approaches, like, say, materialist paradigms, which focus on the economic conditions or social production surrounding the art object. DA forces the classifier, or the system designer, to acknowledge explicitly which theoretical interests, which ways of seeing the world are fundamentally privileged by the system's design choices.
Okay, to really see this combination of DA approaches in action, let's look at a concrete case study you mentioned, an analysis of the Brazilian knowledge organization community. Specifically, focusing on articles published in a particular journal, M. Questão, over nearly 2 decades, from 2003 to 2021.
Yes, this study is a really excellent example of combining multiple DA approaches effectively. The researchers didn't just rely on one tool. They utilized epistemological analysis, that's approach 8. They did semantic analysis of the texts, approach 9, and various discursive approaches. They even incorporated computational corpus linguistics tools like Sketch Engine to analyze language patterns systematically across the articles. They ended up analyzing about 30 relevant articles published in that journal during that period, giving them a really detailed, multifaceted view of that specific community's scholarly production and focus.
So what did this rigorous, multi-pronged analysis actually reveal about the Brazilian KO community's theoretical focus versus its applied focus?
Well, the initial key finding when they mapped the articles onto those 3 core dimensions we discussed earlier, ontological, epistemological, sociological, was quite telling. The Brazilian KO community showed a really heavy focus on the applied dimension system building, practical solutions that accounted for 57% of the articles, and also a strong focus on the epistemological dimension, theoretical foundations, methodological debates at 40%. This suggests, a pretty robust, healthy intellectual environment overall. One that seems to balance actual system construction and practical implementation with strong fundamental theoretical reflection. They seem to be building systems while also rigorously questioning how and why they should be built.
Okay, but if almost all the focus, like 97%, is concentrated in just those 2 areas, applied and epistemological, that implies there must be a significant, maybe even problematic gap somewhere else.
It did indeed reveal what looks like a massive lacuna, a huge gap in cultural dimension. Articles that explicitly focused on the social, political, ethical, or even economic aspects of knowledge organization, what they categorized as the cultural dimension, were almost completely absent. They found only 1 article fitting this description in the entire corpus across nearly 20 years. Now, this is highly significant, especially given that domain analysis itself, as a methodology, is fundamentally rooted in that socio-cognitive paradigm and often draws on critical theory. It strongly suggests a major area of potentially under-researched concern within that community, specifically regarding the broader social implications and impacts of their organizational decisions and systems.
Wow, that is striking. So the focus is heavily on the structure and the building, but perhaps not enough on the social impact or ethical considerations of the final product.
That seems to be what the analysis suggests, yes. A third key finding focused on the specific types of knowledge organization systems being researched and discussed. The semantic analysis using those corpus tools was powerful here. It showed very clearly that ontologies are the single most frequent type of KOS studied and written about in that corpus. Furthermore, the concept of ontologies was strongly linked, linguistically, to active verbs like created, developed, and selected. This reflects pretty clearly the community's strong commitment to achieving semantic coherence and high computational utility in their systems. They appear focused on the most modern, semantically rich, technologically sophisticated types of KOS.
So the theoretical commitment to rigorous epistemology seems to translate directly into prioritizing advanced technical development like ontologies.
It certainly seems that way. And finally, the analysis also revealed a highly specific, emerging thematic trend within the Brazilian KO community. There appears to be a growing focus on the relationship between knowledge organization and archival science, or archivologia. This involves looking at how to apply KOS principles and systems, including those advanced ontologies, to the unique and often complex realities of managing archival materials and records. And specifically within that intersection, the researchers noted a growing recognition of the need for highly specialized domain analysis focused particularly within the juridical domain, the legal field.
The juridical domain. Why would that be such a particularly challenging target for domain analysis? What makes law so tricky?
Well, the legal domain is incredibly complex for several reasons from a DA perspective. First, its ontology, what constitutes a legal fact, a precedent, a right, is constantly in flux. It's shaped continuously by new legislation, evolving court precedents, shifting social values. It's not static. Second, its language is notoriously technical, precise, and often deliberately ambiguous or open to interpretation. Think legal jargon. And third, the information retrieval needs of its core discourse, community judges, lawyers, legislative aides, legal scholars, are incredibly precise and high stakes. Getting the wrong information can have massive consequences. So applying DA effectively here requires a simultaneous mastery of those 11 approaches we discussed and deep specialized subject knowledge in legal theory and practice. It serves as a perfect practical illustration of how DA is really instrumental in bridging different disciplines and tackling the information challenges within the most highly specific, demanding professional contexts.
Okay, so To try and synthesize this really extensive deep dive for you, the listener, we've pretty clearly established that domain analysis is far, far more than just some technical tool for sorting things. It's really a powerful socio-cognitive lens, a way of understanding specialized knowledge in its native habitat, so to speak. It seems to transform the role of the information professional into someone who has to be simultaneously a master of their own craft, skilled in that expansive 11-pronged toolkit we walk through. And they also need to be an informed specialist, or at least collaborate very closely with specialists in the actual subject matter they're organizing.
Absolutely. Ultimately, DA transforms the act of organizing information from what might seem like a neutral, technical exercise into a deeply dynamic, context-dependent investigation, one that's fundamentally rooted in understanding social theories, epistemological commitments, and institutional structures. It forces information science and anyone involved in knowledge organization to acknowledge that classifying knowledge is an inherently non-neutral act. It requires continuous, reflexive, and deeply domain-specific engagement.
And that leads us directly to our final, maybe provocative thought for you to ponder, reflecting particularly on those findings from the Brazilian case study we just discussed. If the ultimate purpose of knowledge organization is to ensure efficient, yes, but also equitable retrieval and access for all potential users, and if, as DA shows us, every system of classification inevitably privileges certain theoretical commitments and user needs over others, as evidenced perhaps by that Brazilian community's intense and undoubtedly useful focus on the applied and epistemological dimensions, then what fundamental social and political commitments might the current global dominance of highly structured, computationally intensive systems like ontologies often prioritize, perhaps, over tackling the challenging, messy cultural critiques and social implications, reveal about the direction we're heading? What does it tell us about the future of information access and equity in our increasingly digital age?
That's certainly something to mull over as you observe how different fields around you are currently choosing to structure and therefore control access to the knowledge that defines them.